Your lecturer is Scott M. Lacey. Dr. Lacey is an associate professor of sociology and anthropology at Fairfield University. He is also the founder and executive director of African Sky, a nonprofit organization that serves hard-working farm families in rural Mali, West Africa. Dr. Lacey earned his PhD in anthropology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. His nonprofit and academic work has been featured in two major documentaries, Sustaining Life and Nyogonfe Together. He is a co-author of two popular textbooks, Applying Anthropology and Applying Cultural Anthropology.
It was my first night with my first host family in Mali, West Africa. And sitting beside my new mother, we laughed together as waves of smoke thwarted every attempt I made to escape their path. Now, mind you, I couldn't speak or understand a thing. We gestured enthusiastically, searching for any words we had in common, words like bonjour and Jimi Hendrix, right? All the while, Roakia, my new 5-year-old sister, she sat beside me, poking my leg in search of a smile. But then she jabbed me a second time, but this time with a heck of a lot more enthusiasm. And glancing over, I found her with the kerosene lantern in her hands. Lamponta, she said. She picked up the lantern. Then, lamponsigi, she placed it back on the ground. Repeating this lesson, and with a wide grin full of expectations, she placed that lantern right at my feet. So, Lamponta, I responded, whisking the lantern right into the air. And everyone erupted in cheers and laughter, but they went silent in a flash. They wanted more. Lamponsigi, I set the lantern back down. And after an impromptu celebration of dancing and clapping, I leaped back into my own seat and announced, Solo Sigi! Over there, you see, I'm known as Solo. And, well, that was my first ever original phrase in Bamanakan. Solo, sit. Now, that may not sound so impressive now. My host family's excitement, though, it instantly affirmed that I had passed my first Bamanakan language lesson. And that's pretty much how I learned everything I know about life in rural Mali. I lived alongside my host. I farmed when they farmed. I ate when they ate. And I slept when they slept because I desperately wanted to understand them, their problems, their dreams, everything. So without formal training, and 2 years before I'd even take my first anthropology course in graduate school, I was intuitively using a classic anthropology research method, namely participant observation through cultural immersion. As a foundational tool in our anthropological toolbox, participant observation, it allows us to viscerally experience, learn, and inquire about the daily lives of the generous people and communities who, frankly, are willing to put up with us. And significantly, participant observation, it allows us to delve much deeper than our questionnaires and interviews because it can reveal what people say as well as what they do. So, from learning how to say lamponsigi to understanding the origins of agriculture and humankind, anthropology inspires us to integrate multiple perspectives to enthusiastically explore our human condition and all its history and diversity. So, what exactly is anthropology? Well, let's start with a basic definition. And this is how I start my Introduction to Fairfield Anthropology course for undergraduates. Put simply, anthropology is the study of humankind over time and space. And bear with me, because I promise, if I were to get any more specific than that, we'd be chopping off specialized branches of our disciplinary tree. You see, in American anthropology, we categorize our discipline into 4 subfields. There's biological anthropology, archaeology, linguistics, and then cultural anthropology. And we use each of these subfields to explore survival and the diversity of humankind across time and geography. Let me explain. First, biological anthropology includes everything from primatology and paleontology to evolution, biology, genetics, and even health and forensic science. And all of those themes, they'll be covered in the early lectures of this course as we answer the big question, who are we and where do we come from? Then, as we move deeper, we'll figure out how Homo sapiens survived while all other upright walking apes have long gone extinct. And to do that, we'll continue to apply biological anthropology, but we'll also draw new insight from archaeology, linguistics, and cultural anthropology. So the next subfield, archaeology, now that uncovers and interprets artifacts. That's what we call material culture. And we look at material culture to reveal the histories of people who are no longer here to share their stories. Like crime scene detectives, we can look at what earlier humans left behind to work out how they lived and died. Next, the third subfield, linguistic anthropology. Now, that's a lot more than just studying language, right? Linguists, they dissect the structure of language. They preserve and investigate dead languages. They tell language histories. They even provide a record of human migrations and cultural interaction. And many of them explore that intricate chicken and egg relationship between language and culture. Now, linguistics. Linguistics help us answer our second big question about how we are the sole surviving upright walking apes. But it also helps us transition to our final major subfield, cultural anthropology. Cultural anthropology is an interdisciplinary subfield that explores kinship, economics, gender, development, religion, art, and, well, just about anything else we humans do. And it's cultural anthropology that helps us work out our third big question. Through cultural anthropology, we'll explore how, despite cultural and linguistic differences, we are one human race. While anthropologists typically specialize in one or more of these subfields, the lines between them, as you'll see, are kind of blurry. In fact, most anthropologists draw on several or all four subfields to investigate our world. And that's exactly what we'll do all throughout this course. But today, to begin our adventure, I want to take you to where I acquired my passion for everything anthropological. So let's go back to Mali so I can share with you the transformative power of this thing called anthropology. My anthropological story begins, well, hundreds of years ago when a cattle herder named Mpan Sangare left his community in Messina, Mali, and he headed south with his cattle. You see, he was walking them far to the south in search of early rains and grasses that could strengthen these cattle in advance of the next growing season. And as he wandered, he came across this beautiful small lake along a seasonal river. And it was replete with birds, fish, grass for cattle, and even some shady groves. Now, his cattle, they drank the clean water, and Mpan rested below a great palm tree, and he awoke from an inspirational dream. He stood right there in place, right beside that lake, and untying his Fulani head wrap, what's what we call a disa, well, he placed that on the ground before him, and he announced to the world, with his cattle and wife as witnesses, that he would build a village here. And today, this small mud block village is named Disan, in honor of the Disa and the vision of Mpan Sangare. So, fast forward to the late 20th century, when some direct descendants of Mpan, along with a handful of others, well, they petitioned Peace Corps to post a volunteer there. And in 1994, I had my first visit with the people of Disan. And in retrospect, I must have been quite a sight, because not yet fully acclimated to the Malian life, I arrived on the back of a beat-up powder blue moped, and I was wearing these matching pants with a local gown-like shirt with these fish prints on it. I mean, plus to complete my freak flag, I also sported some red John Lennon sunglasses under a bright yellow helmet. This is not a picture I share on Facebook. But anyway, things went well despite my wardrobe choice, and rather quickly, I became an adopted son of the village, with mothers, brothers, and more. But I was working out in the fields, and my high-protein maize project was about ready to launch when, unfortunately, I fell gravely ill and was medevaced back to the States, where my convalescence required a medical separation from Peace Corps, and in a flash, Disan was out of my life. I mean, I went to Mali to help the poorest of the poor, but as I lay in the hospital bed, I realized the village of Disan had done more for me than I could ever hope to do for them. So, to honor this debt, I was determined to return to Mali, but this time with more useful skills. And during my convalescence, I discovered anthropology while researching careers that might allow me to forever keep DSON in my life. At UC Santa Barbara, I was trained in four-field anthropology as a graduate student, and my specialization was in cultural anthropology. And as a cultural anthropologist, I've spent the past 2 decades working between family farmers in West Africa and technical experts, including plant breeders, engineers, builders, and even teachers. But that said, let's be clear about my training and role as an anthropologist. First, I'm no plant breeder, but I've studied plant breeding and agriculture long enough to speak their language, hold a conversation, and even understand lab culture. Similarly, I'm not a Malian farmer from rural West Africa. Nonetheless, I've lived and worked alongside Bamana farming families long enough to speak their language and to be a functioning member of the community and household that was kind enough to take me in. So, with a foot in each camp, an anthropologist like me, we can bridge the efforts and knowledge of disconnected experts with something to gain from sharing knowledge and resources. And inspired by that original Peace Corps experience, as an anthropologist, I bridge rural farmers and research scientists, both of whom work hard towards increasing food security for farming families. And this is typical of anthropologists. As we'll see time and time again throughout this course, anthropology builds cross-cultural bridges of understanding. Now, that said, I should probably offer a confession. I didn't really start off as a true bridge builder. I was a hardline farmer-first kind of thinker. I was reflecting on the past few centuries of international development, and at first I was convinced that what farmers in tough ecologies like we have in Mali, all they really needed was for scientists to just get out of the way. But as I spent more and more time living in DSON and more time observing plant breeders in the field, I realized that nobody really has a monopoly on good or bad ideas. On the contrary, alone, both sides of plant breeding in Mali, the farmer side and the plant breeder side, they're not enough. I mean, climate change, socioeconomics, and enduring conflict, they've created a really challenging food puzzle in Mali that neither scientists nor farmers alone can figure out. To the contrary, I learned what elder teachers were telling me from my first day in the village. Bele konikelen tiseka beleta. One finger cannot lift a stone. And even when a great guy named Sidi first taught me that lesson, early on I held out. He physically demonstrated how one finger simply will not lift a stone. But as a young upstart, I licked my finger and I commenced to do exactly that, and I lifted that single stone with the single finger. But as an American, I knew that some fingers can lift a stone, right? Not really true. Before my smirk could transition to a know-it-all grin, that stone, it fell right down. And Sidi, he laughed and said, voila. Sidi, you've passed away, but thank you for that early lesson. You see, Sidi, he helped me see the path of the anthropologist as a bridge builder. So let me give you an example of how my work as an anthropologist has helped bridge the knowledge of scientists on the one side and rural farmers on the other. Early on in my field research, I partnered with Malian farmers to test and evaluate a couple dozen unique varieties of sorghum. Sorghum, it's this fantastic grain that grows well in drier climates. And at one point, we cold tested a dwarf variety that produced plants with incredibly large seed heads, but on really short stalks. And we, with the farmers, we grew several plots of this seed, and these farmers, they were definitely impressed with this new variety's yield potential. After harvest, I asked the big question, Sanware, Jombena Shikuradan. Who's going to plant this variety again? Every single farmer said the same thing. Nte. Not me. Now, just imagine, say you're a scientist, a professional plant breeder, and you've developed this fecund sorghum variety. You did every single thing right. You sought out farmer input on what they want, and most farmers prioritized increased yields as their most desired quality. So, high-yielding sorghum? Check. Then, You experimented until you finally developed that high-yielding variety that invests less energy on the stalk height in favor of increasing potential grain production. High-yielding sorghum. That's exactly what they wanted. Check. Yet, even farmers who admired your dwarf variety chose not to adopt it for their family fields. Why? Well, the answer emerged not from the questionnaires and interviews that we did, but rather they were hidden in the plain sight of daily life. You see, there are a lot of cattle in rural Mali, and it's not uncommon that cows and bulls break loose for an unlimited buffet in some unsuspecting farmer's field. So, with a big and tasty seed head poised right at eye level for passing cattle, this prolific sorghum seed, it's not likely to make it all the way home to the family granary. So, here in this corner of the world, the advantage of increased grain production, it wasn't worth the risk of a bovine catastrophe. And no one can blame a plant scientist, really, for not knowing the dynamic values, constraints, and resources of every single community that might want to test new seed. I mean, what kind of researcher would have the time to conduct that kind of long-term, culturally embedded research? You're looking at one, right? For a cultural anthropologist like me, culture immersion and cross-cultural research, that's my bread and butter. With plant scientists and family farmers as partners, I deploy cross-cultural research methods to bridge our mutual resources, knowledge, and research priorities. And over the past several years, I've used this approach to assemble unlikely cross-cultural partners for mechanical engineering, as well as structural engineering and even design. I've become a specialist in what I now call cross-cultural knowledge production. And I promise you, that wasn't even a thing when I was in grad school. Yet, organically, anthropology and Mali transformed me into a cross-cultural knowledge production guy. Ultimately, I do what many folks call applied anthropology. Now, fierce advocates of applied anthropology, they may consider this as a fifth subdiscipline of our field because applied anthropologists, they tend to differ from conventional academic researchers. You see, in addition to peer-reviewed journal articles, university press books, and academic conferences, we applied anthropologists, we may write annual reports for charities or research institutes. We may help draft legislation or even bring together various stakeholders to improve patient outcomes at a health clinic. These are some of many examples of anthropologists who consider themselves applied anthropologists. And there's an even larger number of us with interdisciplinary training and scholarship. Some of the biggest areas of applied and/or interdisciplinary anthropology include medical anthropology, legal anthropology, education, and, for me, international development. And I promise, those are all topics we'll discuss in future lectures. So, for now, let me return to the image of anthropologists as bridge builders, because it's in that capacity that we're able to produce cross-cultural knowledge, which is to say, knowledge that draws on the experience and understanding of diverse groups who often have very little common cultural ground. Such knowledge is important because it counteracts the problem of cultural bias and blind spots in order to create benefits for a wider swath of humanity. And perhaps, even more starkly, such an approach, it works to mitigate the power inequalities imbued in top-down development programs, or more plainly, it's collaborative co-learning, right? It's a collaborative co-learning ethos rather than that deliverer-teacher model of conventional agricultural extension and development initiatives. To illustrate this point, let's return to my favorite field experiment ever, where we can see anthropology at work as a cross-cultural knowledge producer. After learning there were just over a half dozen unique varieties of sorghum grown in Disan, well, I got a hold of 23 new varieties that no one had ever seen before. And I promise, these weren't frankenseeds, just a wide collection of varieties collected from ICRISAT, the International Crops Research Institute for the Semi-Arid Tropics. They're near Bamako, Mali, and they have a research station there with a very well-respected sorghum breeding program. We followed their protocol, We had a packet of seed for all 23 of their varieties, plus a local variety of our choosing. And together, I apprenticed with each participating family, and we used a handheld hoe to plant individual parcels of each test variety. Farmers loved it. We did 5 square meter plots and planted 8 rows of sorghum in each plot. Now, like we were supposed to, we marked each parcel to identify the now 24 varieties we planted, right? That's 24 packs of seed. And we were supposed to do that right in the middle of the participating farmers' family fields. See, the center of fields, those tend to be the richest parts of fields in Desan. And thankfully, that year, we only had to plant that field once. You see, as a participant observer, one year, that was a few years earlier, I worked with my host family to seed a 5-hectare plot by hand no less than 3 times in a single season. Why? The rain never came. We planted, but the first round didn't take. So we had to repeat the process. And I'll tell you, I remember nearly crying, and seriously, right? I remember nearly crying when I heard we had to reseed that big field yet a 3rd time. But in our experiment, the first planting took. So Brahma Sangre, my host brother and primary farming teacher, you see, I apprenticed with him too, he asked me what we're supposed to do with our extra seed, to which I did one of the best things an anthropologist can ever do. I shut up. I don't know, I said. Then I asked him, instead of the formal trials we previously planted, how does he normally test new seed that he's never seen before? Now, that's some anthropology there, right? We have the formal ICRISAT protocol going on, and now a parallel farmer-led experiment. And the whole experience is teaching me how both scientific plant breeders and farmers work to secure the future of food. Now, you can read about this study in the journal Agriculture and Human Values, but for our purposes today, here are some of the major findings from that study. First, unlike the official plots, farmers, they tend to test novel sorghum varieties on the perimeters of their family fields. Why? Well, they eat what they grow. So when they test new seed, they really don't have the luxury of giving up their most productive spots, the center of their family sorghum fields. But more importantly, Brahma explained to me, right, that when he tests new varieties, he tests them. His existing varieties, they already work in good conditions here. So what Brahma is looking for are new varieties that perform despite less than perfect conditions, like the periphery of the field. Because if they work well in bad spots, they'll emerge as champions elsewhere in the field. And in fact, using his alternative tests, Brahma identified and adopted several varieties that year that he continues to grow and disseminate to this day. Okay, what else? Well, second, unlike official test plots, right? Farmers like Brahma insisted on intercropping the test varieties in their secondary plots. When I asked why, they basically said that they needed to give the seed a chance, right? A fair chance. You see, beans and other legumes, they fix nitrogen in the soil, much to the delight of sister sorghum. And another unpredictable conclusion was that in the secondary tests, farmers didn't even bother sectioning off or marking off unique seed packs. In fact, when we planted Brahma's secondary tests, we walked together, each one of us in our separate furrows, planting 2 to 3 seeds about an inch deep after every short pace. We'd start and Brahma took out a random packet, we split up the seed and planted until we were out. Then we just repeated this process for all the test varieties. There was a point then when I asked Brahma, why aren't we marking off these different seed packets? And I remember his quite generous and surprised smile when he responded with a question. Don't you think I'll be able to figure out if there's anything interesting in there? You see, he didn't need a name. He wasn't interested in this type over that type. He was looking for something that would speak for itself. When I presented this research at the Ministry of Agriculture in Bamako, they literally giggled and even joked a bit about the clear breach of scientific protocol. But they were all ears when I showed our final major conclusion. Amazingly, the farmers revealed the critical importance of doing field work in the anthropological tradition. It seems the farmers not only loved the experiment, but, and here's the twist, after the test plots, they adopted the exact opposite sorghum varieties that their stated preferences indicated. Seriously, it turns out sometimes people say one thing and do another. Before we planted the seed, I asked every household in the village to tell me their desired seed traits for sorghum. And they said they wanted heavy seed. But then in this experiment, they adopted 5 of 8 of the lightest varieties in the whole experiment. And conversely, only 2 of the 8 heaviest varieties. What people say is not what they do. The farmers, they also said they preferred varieties that matured quickly, in 3 months, or even better yet, less. But they only adopted 1 of the 3 fastest varieties. They did adopt 4 of the 5 slowest. The same thing happened with farmers' stated preference for pure white seed coats, and again for their stated preference for large seed. Remarkably, farmers' selections completely contradicted every one of their stated preferences. And this observation, it demonstrates the importance of engaged, long-term field research. Like everyone else, these farmers don't always say what they do or do what they say. And it's information like this that's indispensable for the development of national and international plant breeding programs. I mean, it's clear. We scientists can't just ask family farmers like those in Dison to make a list of desired seed traits. That's a really good start, but as my vignette showed, that list, it's incomplete. Cross-cultural projects in particular require participant observation and other anthropological approaches, all of which begin with inquiries into and engagement with local knowledge and resources. From their methods for testing novel seed to their complex criteria for choosing the right type or types of sorghum for their own family fields, these farmers are amazing. You see, even before we had planted these seeds, merely by looking at these curious test varieties, right, they were spot on with their predictions of weak and strong seed. We used a 5-point scale in the end. They adopted 0 of the varieties they ranked unfavorably at 2.5 or less. And on the other hand, they adopted over half of the varieties they rated absolutely highest. My Malian hosts have taught me more than I can describe in a single lecture, but that seed study remains my favorite, and it produced knowledge that served science and filled bellies at the same time. In fact, it's now the subject of a documentary project called Nyogan Together. Think about this. Without a dime exchanged between them, farmer to farmer, Malian households shared this seed with neighbors and family. And some of these varieties have spread so far, we can no longer track them. I mean, essentially, some of the varieties that started out in our 5 square meter plots, they've spread informally at least as far as 250 kilometers away from our village. And while all this sorghum excitement was going on, back home at UC Santa Barbara, the Engineers Without Borders team proposed a joint project with me and Mali. You see, they wanted to work with Malians to make biofuel using jatropha nuts, which are common all over Dison and southern Mali. So, swapping engineers for plant breeders, I applied my cross-cultural knowledge production approach to bridge science and the knowledge of blacksmiths, farmers, hunters, parents, teachers, and others in Dison. And after spending a year studying the jatropha projects, those engineers, that team, they arrived in Dison. But before I facilitated the start of their jatropha work, I gave them a crash course in cross-cultural knowledge production. And the long story short, by the end of the second day, that team, they decided to ditch their jatropha project, and instead, they wanted to collaborate with the village's water pump repair team. You see, it was during discussions with locals that the team started with jatropha questions, but it didn't take long for the conversation to shift to a topic that was far more important for Dison. Now, don't get me wrong. The folks in Dison, they loved the jatropha idea. But they had a more critical priority: drinking water. And by the time that Engineers Without Borders team left the village, The pump repair team and the volunteers had not only rebuilt the village's 2 water pumps, but they also had established a preventative maintenance routine that has kept those pumps running smoothly for over a decade. And in the old days, I can remember we always had at least one broken pump on any given day in Desan. And given that there's almost 900 people who live in this village, keeping those 2 pumps running, it makes life easier and healthier for all. And best yet, long after this engineering team left Mali, their Desan counterparts have kept those pumps working well. And they've actually become a regional pump repair team, right? They're called upon by communities throughout the Buguni region of southern Mali. Once even, they were dispatched to fix a troublesome pump as far north as a 3-day bus ride. This story, and the story of our collaborative work on sorghum, they illustrate how and why I do anthropology. As a facilitator for cross-cultural knowledge production, for me, anthropology, it's a tool for social transformation. It's my means to creating stronger communities and a happier and healthier world. And as we saw with the Engineers Without Borders team, my true job is to bring disconnected knowledge experts together to help them develop a collaborative mission, and then work myself out of the picture. And that's not to say I no longer need or work with EWB. Currently, my nonprofit is building modest schools and literacy centers throughout Mali, and we make our cement now with a manual mixer created through yet another brilliant collaboration, this time between engineers and Malian masons. Today, we launched our anthropological journey by developing a basic understanding of what anthropology is and how it produces knowledge that matters, knowledge that connects us with the mutual potential of enriching lives. And I've focused on my personal experience today in hopes that it gives you a concrete example of the cross-cultural and interdisciplinary bridge building that anthropology promotes. But bridge building, it's not the unique domain of professional anthropologists. It's something that all of us can do. And a great first step in becoming an effective bridge builder is to learn what the 4 subfields of anthropology have to teach us about human diversity and our unity as a single race. And that's what we'll be doing for the rest of this course. And I'm grateful and delighted to be with you on this anthropological journey.